She is a senior fellow for U.S. Foreign Policy at the Council on Foreign Relations in New York, and she focuses on the Middle East and South Asia. She also directs the Council's Women in Foreign Policy program. Her areas of expertise include democratization, civil society and economic development, regional gender issues, education reform, and microfinance. She is a very prolific author, impressively so. She has written recently 3 books: Paradise Beneath Her Feet, How Women Are Transforming the Middle East, which was published in 2010. Before that, a book called Restoring the Balance, A Middle East Strategy for the Next President, published in 2008. And Strategic Foreign Assistance, Civil Society in International Security, published in 2006. And her writings have also appeared in numerous publications such as Foreign Affairs, Foreign Policy, The Washington Post, etc. In 2010, she's also serving as a track leader for the Clinton Global Initiative. She has a very interesting career. Prior to coming to the Council on Foreign Relations, she was CEO of a healthcare services company and a partner at McKinsey & Company in New York, a Marshall Scholar. She holds a DPhil and an MPhil in International Relations from Oxford University, and she has a BA from Princeton University. She serves on several nonprofit boards, including Plan USA and Student Sponsors Partners. So today we're going to have the pleasure of hearing about her most recent book, Paradise Beneath Her Feet, How Women Are Transforming the Middle East. This book is a really fascinating and insightful account of a growing movement of Islamic feminism, which may foster greater stability and prosperity in the Middle East. I love the book, and I think it's realistic, but it's also somewhat optimistic and a very, very nice account. So I'm looking forward to hearing it and hearing about it, and I hope you join me in welcoming Isobel.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that nice introduction. Thank you for having me here. It's a pleasure to be back at the Woodrow Wilson School, where I was an undergraduate almost 20 years ago now. So it seems like yesterday, actually, that I was here. I'm going to talk a little bit about my book, Paradise Beneath Her Feet. And I thought I would start out by telling you how I came to write this book. I am a senior fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations. I work on the Middle East mostly, and I work on a broad range of economic development issues and some political development issues. But as I traveled through that part of the world, I kept coming back to this issue of women. It's a very contentious issue. There are lots of stereotypes in our country about the role of women in the Middle East. There's lots of stereotypes there about how people in America live their lives. And there's a lot of acrimony around this topic of women. But when you look at the statistics, the Middle East is a part of the world that has underinvested in women, in half of its population. So adjusted for income levels and all sorts of other things, you can look at the both educational levels, workforce participation, political participation, and across the board, the Middle East lags other parts of the world. And back in 2002, the UN did a very interesting report. It was the first human development report they had done for the Arab world. And they were asking the question of why has the Arab world lagged the rest of the world in a variety of measures. And they came down to 3 issues. One was a lack of freedom, the freedom deficit, as they described it. Another was a lack of knowledge. And this was, again, looking specifically at the Arab world. They had some remarkable statistics in this report. The Arab world translates fewer books. In all of its history, has translated fewer books into Arabic than Spain translates in 1 year. And the other issue was a lack of rights for women. And we know that a lack of rights for women has some human rights implications. And you've heard, I'm sure, the headline stories of women being stoned to death, or in Afghanistan, the cover of Time magazine, a woman having her nose cut off. I mean, very horrific stories about women that clearly are human rights issues. But this Arab Human Development Report was looking at it almost more from an economic angle. that this is a region which has neglected half of its population, underinvested in half of its population, and is not getting as much productive benefit from half of its population as other parts of the world. So this report came out in 2002. It caused a lot of controversy. It was written by Arab scholars, but many people in the Arab world rejected it, said, oh, they're biased, they're focusing on negative things. They really tried to dismiss the report. But I was traveling through the region then, and a number of leaders would pull me aside and say, hey, we've read that report. What do you think about that report? Is it important? How important is this? Is it really a big economic issue? And we think it's a big economic issue. We would like to improve the status of women, but it's very difficult for us to do so. We've got all these constraints. We're dealing with very traditional conservative societies. We've got very conservative religious leaders. We've got very powerful Islamist groups that are against changing laws to promote women. And it just intrigued me more and more as I traveled throughout the region and spent time looking at these issues, how people within the region are addressing this topic of women's rights. Now, there has been a women's movement throughout the Middle East in country by country, for almost a century, for more than a century in some countries. But the women's movement over the years has been largely led by very well-educated, elite, secular women. And in recent decades, really going back to the 1960s, you've seen the rise of a political Islam in the Middle East that has equated women's rights with a lot of negative things, with feminism, with Westernism, with consumerism, with materialism, in some countries with communism. All negative associations in the minds of people. And the women's movement in various countries have suffered from these smears and associations. And they have been up against, it's hard. Women's movements in any country have faced the challenge of trying to change culture, ultimately. Even in the United States, we had a women's movement, the suffrage movement in the United States. The official suffrage movement launched at Seneca Falls in 1848 to try to gain women the right to vote. For 70 years, it took 70 years for that to happen. And women's groups were labeled as being anti-family, anti-Christian, later in the century as communists, all sorts of negative associations. And it took a very long time. And you can see a similar thing about women's groups in the Middle East. But what I have seen in recent decades emerging is a new generation of women who are trying to work with religion as opposed to against it. And some of the women approach the topic of women's empowerment and women's rights from a position of deep faith. They have grown up in very conservative religious societies, and yet they're highly educated, and they want their rights. They want their rights along with their religion, along with their faith and their piety. Others are more out of a secular tradition. They have been working for women's rights and running up against this wall of, you can't do that, you can't change it, it's against the Sharia, it's against our religion. And they don't believe it. They understand that there are a range of interpretations, and there are interpretations and versions of Sharia which allow for the legal changes that they're seeking. And so they would prefer, some of these women and women's groups would prefer to be able to fight for women's rights using secular arguments, but they recognize that their societies have become increasingly religious and that they have to address religious arguments to make headway. And so you've seen over the years, go back 20, 25 years, you had religious women's groups and secular women's groups, and there was a lot of antagonism between them. They were very suspicious of each other. And not, again, dissimilar from women's groups in the United States. You have women's groups who are pro-life, who are pro-choice, and there's a lot of tension between groups in America over how they want to approach different topics and different issues. And yet, what I've seen in the Middle East is in recent years, a lot of these groups are trying to work together because they recognize that ultimately what they want is similar. They want an improvement of laws to the benefit of women. And it may be in the realm, it's different country by country. But in many cases, it revolves around family law, which the family law in countries, there are laws that most of us never experience because we're not lawbreakers. But family law affects everybody. Family law dictates things like marriage, divorce, custody, inheritance, things that everybody going through the course of life experiences, or most people do. And so they're very, very important from a day-to-day perspective, very important legal issues that really affect how people, women in particular, live their lives. So family law becomes a very important battleground. And what you've seen are religious women and secular women coming together to try to improve family laws for the benefit of women. So let me give you one example. For many years, there was a secular women's group in Morocco that tried to reform the family law there. And they kept butting up against this argument, you can't do it, it's against the Sharia. And they started a grassroots campaign. They started a signature campaign, and they went out and got 1 million signatures in the country of Morocco. That's a huge number of signatures to show that they had very grassroots support for the changes that they wanted. They also went and started working with religious leaders and saying, look, here are the changes that we want. Is there not a version of Islamic law that can accommodate these changes? And sure enough, the scholars said, yes, indeed, there is. And they worked with the scholars to, in effect, bless the changes to the Mudawana, to the family law that they were seeking. They also had top-down support from the king, who was foreign educated, young King Muhammad, who had taken over from his father, and relatively progressive for that part of the world, and really understood the benefit of promoting women and improving the laws for women. And so it was the combination of the grassroots movement, the top-down support from the king, but very importantly was the religious justification for the changes that were made. Now, the success that the women had in Morocco in reforming the Mudawana was not lost on other people throughout the region, other women who are trying to do a similar thing in their own country. In Iran, the women looked at the success that the women in Morocco had and said, we can do this too. And so they have been following a similar path. They've started a grassroots movement, a very widespread signature campaign to show the very widespread support that they have for the changes that they're looking for on the family law. They've worked with religious leaders in Iran to, in effect, bless the changes that they want. And they've gotten a number of very significant religious leaders to support the changes that they're looking for. What they're missing, of course, in Iran is the top-down support. They're fighting against the government, and which is why I think that they have hit the wall that they have. But there is tremendous support in Iran for many of the changes. In fact, Ayatollah Khomeini's grandson is one of the prominent signatories of the campaign. Just this week, there's a number of reports in the press about the deepening divisions among the clerics in Iran. And there have been a number of clerics who've come out against what the government is doing, against the increasingly autocratic, authoritarian tendencies of the government. And the government has shut down their websites and, in fact, put many of these clerics under house arrest. One of the clerics who has recently been muzzled in this way is Ayatollah Saneh, who I write about in my book. And he's interesting because he issues so many progressive fatwas for the women that the women refer to him as the women's mufti. They love him. And he comes out in support of what they're doing. And a couple of years ago, in Iran, the Ahmadinejad government tried to put through something called the Family Protection Act. That was even a gross misnomer. In fact, it was a way of rolling back some of the laws that are to the benefit of women, and a reversal for women. And the women's groups got together and really used their grassroots clout to hold demonstrations, to lobby the parliament, and they used the clerics very effectively to support the fact that this was actually going to be detrimental to the family, and to get the clerics to come out and say it was against Islam what they were trying to do. So they're very tactically using religious arguments and support to hold the line against, in the case of Iran, against moving even further backwards, and in other countries to try to roll the ball forward. But the women's movement in Iran, I think you saw evidence a year ago of how vibrant and how effective this women's movement is. So many of the demonstrators in the streets were women. You know, the face of the Green Movement became the face of Neda, you know, a very prominent female face that really represents, you know, the hopes and aspirations of young people in Iran. Now, the government is very effective at shutting that down. It has imprisoned so many of the leaders of the women's movement. But I think that the government has won this battle, but ultimately they will lose the war, because this is really a tide that they can't hold back forever. Now, what is driving some of the changes that I talk about in my book? The first is rising levels of education. So it is a part of the world that has underinvested in women relative to other parts of the world, but it's beginning to change. It's definitely addressing the gender gaps. And so now you have countries across the region that have, at the primary school level, equal enrollment of boys and girls, and full enrollment of boys and girls. A country like Egypt, 70 million people, has full enrollment boys and girls at the primary school level. Now, there are dropout rates as you go forward, but girls are now outnumbering boys at the secondary school level and at the tertiary level in a number of different countries. Now, this is a trend that's happening around the world. You know, we just have a report recently about our own country where women, for the first time, outnumber men at the PhD level in the United States. And you see more and more countries having a gender gap at the college level with women outnumbering men. It's beginning to happen in the Middle East. In Iran, 70% of college graduates are women. Even in Saudi Arabia, 63% of college graduates are women. So you're seeing women make gains at high levels of higher education. You know, sometimes when I give this talk, somebody asks me a question. They say, oh, you know, these women, they go to all women universities, fully segregated, and when they get out, they can't get a job. What type of progress is that? And I say, well, what you're describing is America in the 1950s. Wasn't that long ago. Women went to segregated colleges, and when they got out, they could be a teacher, a nurse, or a secretary, and that was it. And there were some real trailblazers out there who paved the way for the likes of me, and I appreciate that. But, you know, what you see happening in the Middle East today is, actually in Iran, you see women working in all professions. There are women doctors, there are women taxi drivers, there are women on construction sites. The co-pilot on my internal flight was a woman. My cab driver in Tehran was a woman. I mean, things that you don't normally even see here in this country. But women work in all aspects of the economy. In Saudi Arabia, that's not true at all. There are whole professions that women are excluded from. And there's also very strict gender segregation in the workplace that makes it difficult for companies to hire women because they need a separate entrance, they need a separate floor, all of these types of things. But it's beginning to change. When you have a majority of your college graduates are women, how can it not? Now, women can't drive in Saudi, but You know, a lot of them, it's a very wealthy country. A lot of them have drivers, and they're figuring it out. And actually, in the years that I've been traveling to Saudi Arabia, I've seen the changes firsthand. When I went, you know, there were no women, or there was a women's section. I go back, and some of these banks now have men and women working side by side. The newspapers, the media companies, women editors, women bureau chiefs. You know, you're seeing the change happening. Really, it's almost like we've gone from the 1950s to the 1960s, 70s, you know, in a compressed timeline in some of these countries, just in the last decade. So one thing is rising levels of female education, and the fact that women are, you know, having academic success, and they're hungry for jobs. Now, people say to me, oh, this is a part of the world that has such high unemployment. If companies are going to start hiring women, they're going to take jobs away from men, and that's bad. But it's not a zero-sum game. There's a lot of interesting data out there that shows that countries that have the highest levels of female labor force participation in the Middle East have the lowest levels of unemployment. Because women not only create jobs for other women, for themselves and for other women, they're creating jobs for men. So you find a very high level of entrepreneurship among women. It's partly because there's a lot of constraints on women going to jobs, going to formal jobs. You know, in Saudi, they can't drive. You know, they're gender-segregated offices. It's hard for them to get a job in different. So what do? They start their own businesses. And you're seeing that happen more and more across the region. And so you have rising levels of education and rising levels of women in the economy. So that's one driver of change. Another driver of change is the media. You know, we hear about things like Al Jazeera, and we think, you know, that it's a bad, you know, Al Jazeera is somehow bad. But I'll tell you, Al Jazeera has revolutionized media in the region, and it's been followed by lots of others. Al Jazeera, Al Arabiya, you know, we've got all these different channels. And it has brought into people's living rooms conversations that didn't happen before. So I'm sure some of you are familiar with the American television show The View. Mm-hmm. President Obama was recently on The View. There is an Arabic version of The View. It's called The Sweet Talk. And it's 4 women sitting around on a chair. I'm sure, Professor Waterbury, you've seen this show at some point. It's very, very popular. One woman is Saudi. She wears a headscarf. Another is Palestinian. Another is Egyptian. One is Lebanese. They do not cover themselves. And it's a talk show format that is very similar to The View. And they discuss all different types of issues, including things like domestic abuse, sexual violence, polygamy, why women can't drive in Saudi Arabia. Should women be allowed to vote? Can women be political leaders? All of these types of subjects. They bring religious scholars on the show to debate these issues. And it brings these conversations into people's living rooms in a way that really didn't occur even a few years ago. 43% of viewers are men. It's a dialogue that has been missing, and men are intrigued by many of the conversations. There's also versions of lots of different types of shows that we're familiar with. American Idol. There's a version of American Idol in almost all these countries. In Afghanistan, there's Afghan Idol. In the Middle East, there's an Arabic Idol. And it's different than what we're used to. But I'll tell you a little bit about the Saudi version of it. They come on and they're not, you know, this is Saudi Arabia after all. They're not, you know, country western singers or, you know, belly dancers or whatever, but they're reciting poetry. And last fall, one of the contestants who came on the show was a woman, fully covered, not just with a headscarf, but with a full abaya and the niqab covering her face, only her eyes showing. And she came on, and it was very, you know, staid, and she sits on the stage like this, and she recited a poem. And the poem was translated such that it was telling the audience, it was live on television, it went something like this: you clerics, You are distorting our religion. You are issuing fatwas that have no basis in Islam. And it went on and on and on. And there was dead silence. And the judges loved her and passed her on to the next round. Now, there were death threats against the judges for doing this. But it opened up, again, a window, a conversation. And you're seeing this happen with more people questioning and talking about why are things done in this way? Why is it that, in Afghanistan, after the Constitution was passed, one of the first battles was over whether women could appear on television. And today, you have women broadcasters, women anchors, women performing on the it's called Afghan Star. You have women playing a very different role in society publicly than they did even a few years ago. And the effect of this is that, in my mind, is that not only is it encouraging conversations that didn't happen before about some very sensitive topics, but it's also showing women in a different light. And the very narrow rules that govern or are supposed to govern the way that women the rules women are to follow in these societies. And you see women who are pushing the boundaries in good ways. It's creating a gap between the rules and the lived reality of people's lives. And it's becoming a wider and wider gap. So let me go back to Iran for a second. In Iran, the legal age of marriage is 13. But the average age of marriage is 24. In Yemen, the legal age of marriage is 16. We don't know what the average age of marriage is, but we think it's about 13. So, there's Iran, the way people live their life today is increasingly disconnected from the way that the clerics are telling them they should live their life. Yemen is a different question. Okay, so a couple of things I've talked about. Rising levels of education, the changing role of media, and the last thing I'm going to talk about is extremism. Many of the leaders across the region, as they've dealt with rising levels of the growing influence of political Islam, the Islamists have made many demands on these governments. And they push back, but the demands continue, and so they throw the Islamists a bone. They say, okay, we're going to give you what you want because just to keep you quiet and to kind of assuage you in society. So we're going to give in on what you want about women because, after all, it's just women and it's a soft topic. And then the other area is education. So these are two areas where the Islamists have really pushed for influence and control. And what's happened is leaders around the region have realized that they made a really bad deal because women and education are the two primary vectors to the next generation. And by giving in effect, to demands that conservative voices have made on these two fronts have created a very dangerous dynamic in some of these societies. So now they're trying to roll it back. And why did the King of Morocco really push these reforms? Well, Morocco has been racked by extremism in its own society. There was a series of bombings in Casablanca and some other cities around Morocco that really shook the fabric of the country, killed a lot of people, and it was very disturbing. And it made the government in Morocco very nervous. And one of the things that they have said publicly is they think that by enhancing rights for women, increasing opportunities for women, it will be a way of rolling back extremism in their own society. One of the things the Moroccans have done, I talked about the reform of the family law, another is that they're training women as preachers. They can do everything the men can do except lead the Friday prayer. And they've said, why are they doing this? Well, they think that it's a way of introducing a kindler, gentler approach towards religion in the rural areas, in some of the villages around Morocco. Turkey has a similar program. Qatar, Egypt, many of the countries now are introducing women as religious leaders with the idea that they're going to be able to connect with people on different issues and in different ways than perhaps men can. And they certainly can have more access to women in the communities, but they really are doing it not just for the women, but for the way that they can connect with people more broadly in these communities. So there is an element of trying to address extremism in their own societies by recognizing that extreme views on women go hand in hand with extreme views. And so they're trying, I see, governments around the region, not all governments, but some, trying to roll back some of the compromises that they've made along the years with respect to women's rights. Now, is this a revolution? No. You know, this is an evolution. And this is, depending on the country, you know, a multi-generational evolution. In some countries, actually, I think you're seeing very rapid change. The country I see the most rapid change, ironically, is Saudi Arabia. Kuwait, and again, a very conservative Islamic country. You know, 10 years ago, the idea of women voting in Kuwait was so controversial. Today, not only do they vote, but 4 women were elected to parliament. And people said, oh, these women, you know, they will never be elected. Not only were they elected, well, they'll never be effective. They go to meetings in parliament. 3 out of the 4 have PhDs. They come back and they blog about the meeting. And they say, once again, Mr. So-and-so didn't show up, and Mr. So-and-so and Mr. So-and-so came unprepared, didn't know their brief, couldn't vote in the meeting, didn't know what we were talking about. They've created like this sensation, and people, you know, really are pleased by what these women are able to do. And so you see, I think you're seeing some rapid changes in some countries, and you're seeing a lot of resistance and pushback too. But the women are careful to try to cast the changes that they're looking for and achieving within the context and within an Islamic framework, and saying this isn't something foreign imposed by us on the West. You know, this is going back to our own Islamic identity, our own rights within the Quran. This is something that they reiterate, you know, again and again. Afghanistan, I write about in my book. This is a country where today there are more girls in school than ever before in that country's history. But there's still more girls out of school than are in school. By some measures, it's going to take 80 years until all girls are in school in that country. I mean, this is multi-generational change. And my guess is we're going to see, you know, 1 step forward, 2 steps back in some of these places. But underneath the zigging and zagging, I think there are some structural demographic changes that are going on, changes happening, and more often than not, it's being led by women. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We do have time for questions. For those of you who haven't been here before, our convention is usually to take questions from students first. But I think we have a lot of time for questions, so people should be able to have their chance. And I'll let Isobel Coleman.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Genevieve, and I'm a senior. I was wondering, at the grassroots level, how much support is there from men for these organizations, or are any of them led by men, sort of part of this whole movement? Could you just talk about that a little bit?
You know, the role of men is so important in this, because ultimately, you know, I gave the example of the suffrage movement in America. You know, it took 72 years for women to achieve the right to vote, but ultimately, it was an all-male Congress that voted for women to have the right to vote. So you have to have men as part of this. And it really varies from country to country. But you do see, I mean, in Iran, you have lots of men who are members of the women's groups and women's movement. You have very supportive fathers and brothers and husbands. You have, I talked about religious leaders, at a very high level, but then you also have local religious leaders. I open my book with a story about going to visit a school in Afghanistan, in the highlands, the central highlands of Afghanistan. This is back in 2002. And I'd heard that the mullah had opened a school for girls. And I was curious, wasn't it the mullahs who were not letting the girls go to school? Like, what's going on here? So I go to this school and talk to the mullah, and he says, how deeply ashamed he was of the educational suicide imposed on his country by the Taliban. And you see him, I describe him in my book as an Islamic feminist. Now, he would be horrified by that term. He wouldn't even know what it means, no doubt. But he's playing his own little role in trying to overturn, some very deeply rooted cultures and traditions in his own society by arguing that, the Quran commands that everyone, boys and girls, learn to go to school. And he says to me, I don't want them in my mosque. This is a nightmare to have them in my mosque. But there's no other place. And so for now, that's where they're going to go to school. So it really depends so much on both men and women. And part of what the women do is try to use the teachings of the Quran to bring the men along. So they're not seen as being somehow against the culture and society and the religion. That is very important to the fabric of society.
Hi, my name is Karen Campion, and I'm also a senior. I spent last spring semester in Alexandria in Egypt, and one of the biggest challenges of that, it was a wonderful experience, but was the sexual harassment. That's really a big problem, especially in Egypt. And talking to Egyptian female friends about this issue, they observe that it's gotten a lot worse in the last 2 decades. Like in the 70s and 80s, it wasn't actually even a big problem, and it's gotten much, much more violent and pronounced, in the last few decades. And I'm wondering how that sort of fits in with this idea of women, creating more social space for women to take a public role. Do you see any?
Well, I think that part of what you're seeing that's changed in the last 20 years is that women are taking a more public role. And so I don't know if 20 years ago that there's more harassment because women are out more. Mm-hmm. One of the things that, when I go back to the media, these are really taboo subjects that people don't talk about, but now they're being discussed in public. And as you get more women journalists, more women on television, they talk about it and they bring it out into the open. I mean, not just harassment, but sexual violence, incest, rape, and these were issues that were never talked about before. So I think partly what you're seeing is that they're now being talked about and discussed openly, and people are now encouraged to come out and talk about it more. And so that's part of the dynamic of what you're seeing. But it takes a long time to get from here to there. And we see this in our own country too. Incidents of rape, reported rape, has gone up in years, not necessarily because more rapes are happening, but because people were more comfortable reporting it, and we have many more mechanisms to capture that information, at hospitals, police. I'm sure you've heard all the stories about 30 years ago, women couldn't report rape in this country. It was too shameful. It was swept under the carpet. And now it's out in the open. People talk about it, and that data is collected. And you're beginning to see that happen. Just even in the media, that things are talked about and discussed that never were before.
I'm Alexandra. I'm a junior. And I was wondering why men would not be in the majority of graduates at the tertiary level of education. What is bringing them out of the education at that level?
It varies country by country, but one of the main things is the lack of jobs that they see a value in the education. So in Iran, there's very high unemployment, and men are leaving universities because they don't see the value in staying in college if it's not going to result in a job for them. They're going to work in the family business without the education. In Saudi, you see men more likely to go overseas for their education, which bumps up the percent of women in the local universities. But what it's an indication of is that at the local level, you do have very high levels of women completing college. But when I was in Iran, the women are very dismissive of the men because they don't have the same levels of education. And they say, we don't want to get married. We don't want to marry these guys. They don't speak 3 languages like we do, and they're not traveled like we are. And I think, oh my gosh, what's happened to romance in Iran? But it's a very worrying, trend. And I said, well, what are the men doing? Well, they sit home and play on their PlayStation. This is what they told me. And the women are, they're staying in school, and they're starting NGOs. They have higher levels of entrepreneurship among women than among men. So it's not necessarily a positive trend, but it is something that is happening.
Questions. What kind of backlash are you seeing, and what is the Arabic term for the word feminism in the U.S. has a huge negative historical baggage with it. What would be the correlating term in Arabic and backlash?
Well, I mean, the backlash is what I started out talking about. There's been enormous backlash towards women and women's groups, which is why women have really moved towards approaching women's rights from within more of an Islamic discourse. Not to talk about it as a Western feminist concept, but really more as a local, inherent Islamic concept. So the rights that they're looking for, they justify. Some will use a number of different arguments, but an important one is the religious argument. The term feminism has a lot of baggage, not only, here too, but also in that part of the world. And when I use the term Islamic feminism, everybody dislikes it.
So what do they call themselves? What are they called by?
They will call themselves Muslim feminists. They would like that. Or they call themselves Muslim women working for women's rights. So some don't like the feminist part. Some don't like the Islamic part. So people dislike it from various sides. But ultimately, what they're doing is using Islamic arguments to promote greater rights for women.
Hi, I'm Amber. I'm a first-year student, or second-year student in the grad program here. I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the role of Christian women. For example, Syria has a lot of Christian women, but there's also issues with honor killings and that kind of thing there. So I was just wondering how they fit into the dialogue, because I don't think they're going to go from the Islamic standpoint, as it were. I don't know if you've studied that.
Well, I didn't focus on that.
Okay.
And there are Christian minorities in Syria, Lebanon. Iraq had a vibrant Christian minority that I think has mostly left the country at this point. They have their own issues as minority religious groups within a increasingly intolerant societies in many cases. But in terms of honor killings, one of the things that honor killings are often justified on Islamic grounds. And what you've seen in Turkey, for example, is the AKP, an Islamist party. They claim that they're not an Islamist party. I think of them as an Islamist party. But they have been very vocal and outspoken on how honor killings are against Islam and using religious justification to fight against a practice that is, relatively widespread throughout the culture. And that has an impact not only for Muslim women but also for Christian women, in that if the laws are strengthened, the real issue is that if the grounds on which they can get away with it is the brother or the father or the uncle kills the girl who has supposedly transgressed the honor of the family. And in Islam, the victim's family can forgive the perpetrator. And it so happens that the victim's family is also the family of the perpetrator. And so then, you've seen loopholes legally in countries like Pakistan and others that therefore there's no punishment for these honor crimes, or they're not punished. And what's happening is the laws are being strengthened to get rid of those loopholes, and that's to the benefit of all women.
I just have a question about the difference between how Sunni women approach the interpretations in the Quran and how Shia women approach the interpretations. So if you could possibly talk about how maybe women in Iran view the Sharia and how they use it to their advantage, and how women in Egypt, which is a Sunni majority country, use it to their advantage. And also in countries such as Lebanon, where there's a large population of Sunni and Shia, do the women work together, although they have different interpretations? Or?
So the question is, are there differences in the way that Sunni or Shia women approach Sharia? And, when I started writing this book, people would come up to me and say, oh, well, in the Shia faith, it's much more liberal than the Sunnis. Shia would say this to me. And then Sunnis would say, well, the Sunnis are much more progressive and liberal than the Shia. It's the Shia who are crazy on this stuff. And I think the fact is that there are very conservative interpretations of Sharia within the Sunni world and within the Shia world. And, there's just a broad spectrum of interpretation in both. So you can find very conservative, narrow interpretations of the Sharia in both. And you can find, more progressive interpretations. Now, the one thing that the women do and use is this whole process of ijtihad, which is applying reasoning to Islamic interpretation law. And it is a more developed element of Islamic jurisprudence within the Shia world or it is more widely accepted and used than in some Sunni schools. But that, I think, is, again, there's a pretty wide debate there. But at the end of the day, I would say that you can find progressive and conservative interpretations in both.
You spoke as one of the drivers you said was government interests in promoting women's rights and based on the rise of Islamism. I wonder if some of this enlightened self-interest is also because the government wants to gain sort of the admiration of half the population, because if it promotes the basic human rights of half the population, that might increase its legitimacy in the eyes of half the population. I think definitely in Iraq, Saddam Hussein opened up a lot of educational opportunities for women, also provided them with child care, and maybe his intention was not necessarily to promote women's rights, but it was to sort of legitimize himself in the eyes of half of the population. So my question is there a danger that cooperation between women's movements and governments, these authoritarian governments, could actually increase their authoritarian power in terms of legitimacy?
Well, just a quick note on Saddam Hussein. I don't think he was necessarily appealing to the women's vote in the country, because I'm not sure it was necessarily important for him to get elected. But he was appealing for, international prestige. It gave him sort of, he would like to talk about how progressive his country is. And he would point to the senior women in his government, and then 20% of parliament in Iraq was women in the 1980s. But then very cynically, in the 1990s, he reversed much of that, because after the first Gulf War, he was under enormous domestic pressure from various groups, and to appeal to conservative Shia groups in his country, he rolled back many of the laws with respect to women. So there was a very cynical approach that happened there. I think you see somebody like President Musharraf in Pakistan talk a lot about women's rights, really as a way of appealing to American audiences more than anything. It was very much geared towards the international audience, and in particular the American audience that was paying billions into the Pakistani treasury, during his tenure. And then on the ground, he did some things, but not a lot for women. So there was a sort of a cynical element there. I don't think that improving women's rights in these countries is a straight line towards greater democracy. I don't believe that. I think you can improve women's rights and still have very authoritarian governments. But I think that improving women's rights creates more of the conditions for successful democracy to take root. And I think it also, both by having a more educated and empowered society, more women in civil society, and I think it also helps improve, the economy. We have so much data on that. But does it lead straight line to greater democracy? No. I mean, if it did, then Iran today would be the most democratic country in the region, and it's not. But I will tell you, when that government falls in Iran, and at some point it will, Iran will emerge as the most progressive society in the region, partly because women have such an enhanced role today versus other countries in that part of the world.
I just want to know if you could maybe delve a little bit more into what you think the role and impact of the international community has been in this area, whether it's been positive or negative, both microfinance investments as well as on-the-ground NGOs or soldiers, etc.
It's mixed is the answer. The role of the international community has been important in helping create capacity within a lot of these women's groups. They provide important resources and training and technical support for a lot of these women's groups. They wouldn't exist were it not for international funding and support in many cases, because it's been hard for them to raise local support. And yet, when they're seen as sort of tools of the West, then their impact is lessened, which is part of the reason that they really adopt a very local persona and use, a lot of these religious arguments that I've been talking about. When I was trying to answer that question in the book, what can the West do? What can international organizations do? I was concerned, well, there's not much we can do. If we kind of help them, it will undermine their authenticity. But I don't really believe that anymore. I think that these women who run these organizations are very savvy, they're very smart, and they know how to use support, outside support, effectively. They know when it's going to help, and they know when it's going to hurt. And they're the best judge of that. So if we are there and offer support, it's up to them to accept it or not. And in many cases, they do accept it. There's a woman I write about in my book, Sakina Yaqubi, an Afghan woman. I say, Sakina, all of your schools in Afghanistan, the money comes mostly from the United States. Does that cause a problem for you? And she looks at me and says, why should that cause a problem for me? The Karzai government's on the dole. 80% of the budget of the government comes from the international community. Why can't my little organization get money from the West? I say, well, that's a very good point, But she doesn't advertise it broadly. She does what she needs to do. But I think one of the ways that they've been very effective, as I said, is in building capacity of these organizations, training, financial resources, also networking, connecting women in Morocco with women in Iran, with women in Malaysia. There's this organization, Sisters in Islam, that has done so much of the groundwork of, teaching women who are trying to push for their rights within Muslim-majority countries, teaching them strategies and tactics and arguments that are effective in that work. And that work has been supported by international organizations and translated to other situations by international organizations. you see a lot of cross-border and sort of transnational movements emerging that are, as I said, supported by international groups. And microfinance, of course, Ford Foundation, they've done a lot of bad things in the world, but hey, they helped, jumpstart microfinance and with Grameen back in the 70s in Bangladesh. And that has, spread to many different places in the world with, in different iterations. So, you do see international organizations playing an important role, and one that I think women's groups appreciate and desperately need from these various countries. You had a question.
Jessica and I were on the same page.
Okay. Any others?
I'm Sarah, and I'm a freshman. With women being able to achieve higher levels of education, can you see anything that's like a female brain drain in some of those countries?
A female brain drain.
That people are wanting to leave those countries now that they've received education.
It's very hard for men and women to leave because it's hard for them to get visas to go to Europe today. It's increasingly hard, and to the United States, which is really where they want to go. You do see from some of the poorer countries, you see a lot of migration of Egyptian men to the Gulf and to work because there are jobs there. That's harder for women because it's a much more difficult environment for them to work in. So I don't see a lot of that happening, although you do see more sort of in technical, like nursing. There are a number of nursing schools in Egypt and Morocco, and you do see that labor movement to Europe. You have a rapidly aging population in Europe. You have a very young population in the Middle East. And it's very hard for men, as I said, to get visas now to go to Europe and the United States for obvious reasons. And it's a little easier for women, and particularly if they're trained as healthcare workers. So you do see a bit of that, but not what I would think of as a big brain drain. Yeah, but that might happen.
How do you see the role of tradition in interpreting the different versions of Islam? Like we see in Pakistan, for instance, they have tradition that kind of overrules all the rules of Sharia.
Tradition is incredibly strong. It's incredibly strong, which is why, in many cases now, it's the tradition that is the most difficult and the most debilitating for women, which is why they're now appealing to Islam as a way of countering tradition. And what's happened over the centuries is tradition and religion have been conflated. And what they're trying to do is peel that back and to separate that. So they say, this is not Islam, this is tradition. And that's why they're working with religious leaders to help get that message across on something like honor killings, which is really much more of a tradition than it is religion. Female genital cutting is a tradition. It's not Islamic, and yet it's a very deeply rooted tradition. And so to combat it, you see them turning to religious leaders to get them to talk about how it's anti-Islamic and to preach against doing it, because it takes that level of intervention, not from some Western NGO, but really from a very influential community leader, a religious leader, to overturn those traditions. And that is what I see happening on the ground more and more.
Mubarak's greatest fear is that if he lets election go around, the Muslim Brotherhood would. There's been a trend in Gaza, for example, towards stricter forms of Islam. Algeria, there was a case. Do you see that, even though you indicated that women are trying to work within the framework of Islam, But you see the tendency when people are free to vote towards going towards Islamization, you see that as a counter to what you have been describing.
One of the reasons that I think the Muslim Brotherhood is so strong in Egypt is because people are so sick of the pharaoh. You know, I mean, the 70% of the population has known nothing other than Mubarak. You know, Mubarak was in power when they were born, and they fully anticipate that the pharaoh's son will become the next pharaoh, and they're very frustrated. And you know, the secular parties don't have the broad appeal, and they, you know, the Muslim Brotherhood slogan is Islam is the solution, and many people believe that because they've never had, you know, it's never been tested. Now, the reason I keep coming back to Iran as the most progressive country is because they've lived under a theocracy, and they're really tired of it. You know, there's actually a fascinating movie. I think it's called The Lizard, but it's about a guy in Tehran who needs to get out of the city, and the only way he can think of doing it incognito is to dress as a mullah. And the rest of the movie is everybody spitting on him, and the taxi's trying to swerve to kill him. And, you know, it's just a sign that there's a very vibrant film industry in Iran of how people are just tired of the clerical class. You know, they don't believe in the clerical class as the solution. And, you know, I think if there were an election, an open democratic election held in Egypt, that, you know, the Muslim Brotherhood would win a majority. What they would do with it, I don't know. And somebody asked me before about the role of, you know, does having to appeal to the women's vote, is that part of what's driving some of these authoritarian leaders? I don't think it's what's driving the authoritarian leaders, but the Muslim Brotherhood has, as it's gotten a little bit of space to compete politically in Egypt, one of the things it's had to do is to try to appeal to the women's vote. And you've seen a lot of debates within the Muslim Brotherhood over these roles, over these issues of women. And they came out, they issued their platform. In effect, what do they stand for? This was a couple years ago. And they said, you know, in it they said that a non-Muslim and a woman could not lead the country. And this caused a furor, you know, from all the secularists who said, oh, you know, we knew it, you know, they're anti-women and they're anti, you know, other religions, no tolerance here. It caused a real debate within the Muslim Brotherhood itself, particularly among younger members. Why? Why can't a woman be head of the Muslim Brotherhood and head of the country? Why can't a non-Muslim? You know, what do we stand for? And this played out on the Muslim Brotherhood's website. You know, they have a blog, and you could see all this back and forth going on. So I don't know what would happen if the Muslim Brotherhood took over in Egypt. But, you know, there are people like Saadid Ibrahim, who has spent many years of his life in Mubarak's prisons, who says, I want to take my chances with the Muslim Brotherhood, you know, over what we've already got. I don't know. You know, I don't know where we would come out. But one of the interesting things is how they have had to appeal to women as voters and also make movement on women's rights as a way to assuage the concerns of those who are very, very suspicious of the Muslim Brotherhood. So again, it's like one of these cards that have been played.
Well, we have time for one more.
Okay. Yeah.
Because I already asked one, so Cindy.
Anybody else? You get the last question.
Okay, great. I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit about what the differences are, if you see any, between the way these women in these different societies, whether it be they Afghan, Arab, whatever, are working for women's rights, how they define women's rights that they're working for, and the way that someone from a Western audience might define women's rights. If you could talk about those differences and if that plays out at all.
Well, I do hope you'll read the book because these countries are so different and they start from such different points. So in Afghanistan, I think if you asked women, you know, what is the right that you're most concerned about? And they say it's the right to go to school. You know, in Saudi, it would be the right to own our own business. In Iran, it would be a whole host of legal rights, you know, that irk them. You know, as I said, the average age of marriage is 13, but the legal age is 13, the average age is 24, but it irks them. They don't want this. Stoning. You know, the idea that a woman could be stoned to death in Iran. You know, there's a very widespread grassroots movement in Iran called Stop Stoning Forever. The idea that a woman could be stoned, a person could be stoned in Iran. You know, so it really, you know, it varies country to country. But ultimately, I think it's about, a lot of it has to do with family law, because those are very important, as I said, you know, laws that affect how people live their lives. And, you know, custody, divorce, inheritance, these types of things. But also, you know, so there are legal issues, but then there's traditions. You know, and the traditions vary enormously. You know, why cannot women drive in Saudi Arabia? You know, as far as I know, there were no cars at the time of Muhammad. He said nothing about driving. You know, and we do know that his young wife Aisha, rode camels into battle. You know, so, but that's not what they're going to lead with, because they want economic control. They want to be able to own and build their own businesses. And in other countries, it's different. You know, so I think it really varies. And you know, in the book, I write about these remarkable women who are trailblazers in their own societies, doing really incredible things to push and to change and to create positive change for the next generation. So I hope you'll read the book. Thank you.